Hi, my name is Josh Gottry. Welcome to today's weekly lesson. Today we're going to be talking about rolls on timpani. A couple of key things that we need to make sure are in place before we start talking specifically about rolls. Just to review some basic concepts. Number one, playing spot. Playing the wrong place on the timpani head will inevitably generate a roll that you will not be happy with. So it's really important that we strive for that great playing spot about a third of the way from the edge towards center, but use your ear as your guide to make sure you get that best spot. So in that nice warm resonant sound, not too tubby or punchy, about here, not too thin like the edge, not too tubby like we get as we move too far towards center. That's the first thing. Second thing, we want to make sure that both mallets are playing the exact same distance from the edge when playing rolls. A lot of students I've seen are tempted to play rolls, especially if they're going back and forth between two drums, kind of on the inside edge of the drum. And you notice inevitably that puts one mallet closer to the edge and one mallet closer to the center, and you're going to hear slightly different sounds out of those two mallets. Since a roll requires consistent, repeated strokes that sound the same to give the impression of sustain, we want to make sure that we do our best to make sure our playing spot is in the same distance from edge to center with both mallets. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to play with both mallets in the exact same spot. In fact, playing the exact same spot tends to allow one stroke to mute the previous stroke. So that's not always the ideal. In fact, it's best if you separate your mallets ever so slightly from each other to make sure they're not canceling each other out as you play. Give an example of that. I'm just going to play some nice relaxed 16th notes with both mallets striking the same spot, and then I'm going to separate them by about 2 to 3 inches. And I want to see if you can hear the difference between the two. So here's the same spot. To make sure I play with the same type of stroke as I go back and forth, so that you're really just hearing the difference between the playing spot being separated or hitting that same dot on the drum. And it is a little bit more legato to keep those mallets slightly separated. I wouldn't go too far. Again, as the further you go, number one, the more you're trusting that every lug of this drum is exactly the same tension, so you're creating the same pitch in every spot on the drum. So a little variance in pitch will also make your roll sound less smooth. And then also, the further away you get, the harder it is to make sure that you are really the exact same distance away from the edge towards center with both mallets, and so you run the risk of being a little less consistent in your sound as you're rolling, in the quality of sound you're getting for the drum, and therefore that'll affect the evenness of your roll. Okay. Next thing we need to talk about in terms of rolls on timpani is that we do play an open single stroke roll on timpani. On the snare drum, we typically play a double stroke or a buzz roll, but on keyboard instruments and timpani, we most often play with a single stroke roll. And the reason why is the drum already rings, and so all we're doing is trying to sustain that ring. For a snare drum that is basically, you play it and then the sound just almost dissipates immediately, we have to hit the drum more frequently to create the impression of sustain. On instruments that ring or sustain naturally, we don't have to strike the drum quite as frequently to create that impression of sustain. So we're going to use a single stroke roll on timpani, just like we do on most mallet instruments. Okay, so how fast should that single stroke be? By the way, let me just do this one quick thing. I'll play what a buzz roll would sound like on timpani. You'll notice it's more muted than sustained. You see how much the buzz, the repeated stroke, actually creates a decrease in sound rather than a sustain of sound. So we're going to use a single stroke roll, and the question is, well, how fast do we play that single stroke roll? I'm going to start with something fairly moderate, maybe even a little bit slow for a roll, and I'm going to try and create the greatest sustain with that stroke in that context. with both hands, try to create very even rhythms. Even though I'm going very slow at this point in time, most of us would say, no, that's far too slow for a roll. Okay, but that gets us the concept of what we're trying to strive for as far as evenness. Go a little bit faster. Again, striving for that real even stroke. If I'm going to roll on this drum, especially at this pitch, I'm probably still going to need to roll a little faster in order to generate what appears to a listener to be sustained, especially if I'm going to go louder on the drum as well. Okay, so I'll go that same volume, again, a little faster still. Place where you say, okay, that's probably a reasonable speed for that volume on this drum. Now, if I'm going to play on this drum, the 29-inch drum, that's a little bit lower drum, a little bit looser head thereby because of that pitch. And so I can probably roll ever so slightly slower, or maybe that speed, and still get a nice sustained sound. You can see that that same speed I was playing over here sounds a little bit smoother or a little bit more continuous on this drum, on the 29-inch drum, than it did on the 26-inch drum. So that tells us that when we play on the drum, higher pitch, we're probably going to need to roll faster than we play on a lower drum with a lower pitch. And that's just intuitive. This drum already rings longer, and the whole purpose of playing a roll is just to sustain that sound through repeated strokes. Don't play any more repeated strokes than you need to. All you're doing is cutting off the resonance that already exists. If I'm going to play slower, if I'm going to play softer, I can play even slower with that roll. Whereas if I'm playing louder, I would probably need to play faster with that roll. Again, to sustain the continuous volume of that sound at that louder level would require more strokes. Just a quick review: make sure you're playing the right spot on the drum. Separate your mallets ever so slightly to create a situation where you're not muting the previous stroke. Try and keep the evenness of both the volume and the rhythm as consistent as possible. And then as you play the drum, listen for how fast you need to roll to create that sustain without rolling too fast and muting. And keep in mind that that's going to change depending on two factors. Number one, the pitch of the drum, and also the volume that you're playing. The higher the pitch, the faster the roll. The louder the volume, the faster the roll required to sustain sound on timpani. Enjoy. Good luck.